In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why Great Spears are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is our 16th video showcasing all the weapons in a given category, going through their pros and cons to help you make a better decision if you want it to be part of your build or not. Before I get into the weapons themselves, however, first let's take a look at what the pros and cons of this weapon group are, as well as the styles of play I think most players will use when using a Great Spear. The first pro of this weapon group is their exceptional reach. Most of them have very long reach, allowing you to hit enemies from a safe distance. They also deal piercing damage, which can deal counter damage in this game. If you didn't know, when you're attacking enemies while they are attacking you in their forward animation with thrust damage, you deal what is called counter damage, which is increased damage to them. And since all Great Spears deal at least some thrust damage, it's possible to get counter damage with them, and because of their long reach, it makes it easier for them to do, which is why the Spear Talisman does increased counter damage, and it's named after this weapon group. Additionally, Great Spears have a running attack that hits multiple times in rapid succession and usually pushes the enemy back following this animation, which allows you to use things like Rottenwing Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis to great effect when using this attack, as you can stack this buff instantly just by doing one running attack with a single Great Spear. Additionally, this weapon group can block and attack at the same time, not unlike spears or thrusting swords or heavy thrusting swords. Additionally, when dual wielding this weapon, the running L2 attack is extremely deadly, as is the jump attack with both weapons. The cons of this weapon group are that they deal mostly thrust damage, which can be resisted, making it difficult for them to deal damage against some enemies, and thrusting attacks have sometimes difficulty hitting concave-shaped enemies where you lock onto their torso because they're the farthest distance from you. Additionally, 5 of the 6 Great Spears cannot be infused, meaning that you're stuck with the Ash of War on them whether you like it or not, and a lot of these weapons cannot be found very easily in the game. Moving on to the styles of play that I think people will use when using a Great Spear, I think it's highly likely that most players will either use a Great Shield and a single Great Spear doing a block counter style of play, or that they will dual wield Great Spears trying to hit rapidly with L2 attacks that deal increased damage, or doing jump attacks with L2. Those things being said, let's move into the Great Spears themselves, starting with the unique Great Spears, and the first one is the Treespear. The Treespear has a unique R2 chain. The first R2 is a heavy forward thrust similar to the Lance's R2, and then it has a downward diagonal slash starting from your left side and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a Great Spear in Elden Ring weighing 9.5, and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and faith in order to use. The Treespear is a unique weapon because it deals both physical and holy damage, yet it can still be buffed. It's the third longest Great Spear, and you can find it relatively early in Liurnia of the Lakes. Holy damage is not great, but it deals about 65% physical damage, so that's a small consolation. Its weapon skill, Sacred Order, buffs your damage by 10%, as well as increases your damage versus undead by 100% for 60 seconds. This buff stacks with Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, but does not stack with other weapon buffs like Lightning Armament. This allows you to use it both inside and outside of Faith builds. Note that it will also increase your damage if you swap off this weapon after casting this buff. The Treespear scales best with Dexterity, and its sweet spot is 50 Dexterity with minimum points in Faith and Strength, which scale very similarly to one another. I do recommend getting Faith to at least 25 when using this weapon though, since you can use Golden Vow that way, which is a natural pairing with this weapon. Focus on Strength after Faith hits 25 in order to use a Great Shield, but then swap back to Dexterity until you hit 80. Because Sacred Order only needs to be used every 60 seconds, the Treespear is a great candidate to be paired with a Jellyfish Shield, which can also boost damage. This allows you to get over 1200 attack rating when stacking buffs, and play a block counter style play with very high attack rating with regular attacks and R2s. Additionally, the Great Spear makes a good candidate for an offhand weapon if you're planning a dual wield setup, because its weapon skill Sacred Order will also buff your main hand, and this allows you to use a weapon skill in your main hand that can do some other effect. Next up, we have Serpent-Hunter. The Serpent-Hunter has an R2 attack that is a horizontal slash similar to Siluria's Tree and Vyke's War Spear, and deals physical damage. It's the heaviest Great Spear in Elden Ring, weighing 12, and requires 0 stats in order to use. The Serpent-Hunter is essentially a cross between a Great Sword and a Great Spear. It has poking attacks with its R1s, but also has slashing attacks with its R2s. It's tied for the shortest Great Spear in Elden Ring, and it's also the heaviest Great Spear, but it does have 0 requirements, so you could theoretically use it from the very beginning of the game on any character if you could get one, but it's not located until the end of Volcano Manor, which is a ways into the game. Great Serpent-Hunt is a deadly weapon skill dealing incredible damage if you can land it or its follow-up attack. You can often 1 or 2 shot most enemies with it because it deals thrust damage, which also allows it to deal counter damage, which is further improved by the Spear Talisman, so I highly recommend using this if you use this weapon. Shard of Alexander or Warrior Jar Shard are also must for this weapon. It has an incredible long windup though, making it tough to use against mobile targets, but it does have insane poise, allowing you to tank everything but the heaviest hits. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 55 strength, but it scales well up to 80 strength and scales better than most weapons up to 99. No other attributes are needed for this weapon. I like to use this weapon two-handed to get additional damage from the strength scaling and to lean into Great Serpent-Hunter for tough enemies. I use the running R2 attack that hits multiple times against weaker enemies and use its regular R2 when I need to AoE a group of enemies. You can also block counter effectively with this weapon since it has 55 guard boost at max upgrade, which you can improve further with a Great Shield Talisman. Up next we have Siluria's Tree. Siluria's Tree has an R2 slashing attack similar to the Serpent-Hunter and Vyke's War Spear and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a Great Spear in Elden Ring weighing 10 and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity and faith in order to use. Siluria's Tree is a deadly Great Spear with the second longest reach, but it can't be acquired until Deep Root Depths, and it deals 50% holy damage, which is resisted by many of the hardest bosses in Elden Ring. Siluria's Woe hits like an absolute truck and has great range when charged, which subsequently increases its damage. When combined with Godfrey Icon and Shard of Alexander, you can one-shot some of the most challenging enemies in one use from a safe distance, making it one of the stronger weapon skills in Elden Ring. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 50 strength and 50 faith with minimum dexterity. You'll continue to increase these to 80 before taking dexterity to 50. All three stats increase the weapon's skill damage, which does a mix of physical and holy, so there is no reason to prioritize one over the other, unlike with some other weapons. Because this weapon naturally scales with strength and faith, it makes a good candidate for the Clawmark Seal, as well as a great shield for block counters. Siluria's Tree is extremely long, and this means it's easy to connect on nearly every block counter, and this also allows you to use Siluria's Woe when needed. Up next, we come to Vyke's War Spear. Vyke's War Spear has a slashing R2 attack similar to Serpent-Hunter and Siluria's Tree and deals physical and fire damage. It's the lightest Great Spear in Elden Ring, weighing 8 and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and faith in order to use. Vyke's War Spear's claim to fame is of course that it does madness buildup, making it a PvP weapon by nature, though it can still be used in PvE just without madness playing a huge role. It's also tied for the shortest Great Spear and causes madness buildup on yourself when you use its weapon skill, Frenzy Flame Thrust. Frenzy Flame Thrust launches you into the air, coming down, plunging your spear into the ground with flames coming out all around you. If you connect with the spear, you deal much more damage than just the fire, so try to land on your target if possible. It's not the greatest weapon skill, but it's certainly better than most, especially since the fire will continue to damage enemies for a couple seconds after the skill has been completed. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 dexterity and minimum requirements in both strength and faith, however this weapon scales well up to 80 dexterity. I would then take faith up to 50 and strength up to 50, but consider taking faith up to 25 earlier on in order to use Golden Bough. I like to use this weapon in a dual Great Spear setup with the Treespear in the other hand. This is because they have very similar scaling and because Sacred Order will buff both weapons, and then you're free to use Frenzy Flame Thrust as needed easily. The running L2 hits many times, so be sure to use Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, or Winged Sword Insignia with this build if possible. Jump attacks also do stupid damage with this setup, so the Claw Talisman is also a great choice. And the last unique Great Spear is Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear. Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear shares the default attack of other Great Spears and deals physical and fire damage. It has an average weight for a Great Spear in Elden Ring weighing 10 and requires a lot of points in Strength and Arcane and some dexterity in order to use. Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear is the longest Great Spear in Elden Ring, and it does native bleed build up on hit, but you have to beat Mohg Lord of Blood to get it, which can be difficult to do early on in the game. Its weapon skill, Blood Boon Ritual, is deadly if you can execute it in a group of enemies or up close against a boss, but it has a long animation that can be interrupted if not timed properly. You can cast it 3 times in a row, which can wipe out bosses in one go, and it does bleed buildup as well. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 55 Arcane and 50 Strength, with Arcane not only increasing both physical and fire damage, but also increasing blood buildup on hit, so you'll want to prioritize that over Strength. The weapon also scales okay up to 80 Dexterity, so you'll eventually want to take this up as well. Because of the strength this weapon needs, it makes a good candidate to pair with a Great Shield, or you can use it alone to gain extra damage from two-handing. Make sure to use the Lord of Blood's Exaltation in boss fights and the Spear Talisman for extra counter damage. And lastly, we come to the Lance, which is the only non-unique Great Spear. The Lance shares the default attack of other Great Spears and deals physical damage, and has a light weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 9 and requires some points in strength and some dexterity in order to use. The Lance is the only Great Spear that can be infused and have its Ash of War replaced, and it can also be found very early in the game in Limgrave, southwest of Death-Touched Catacombs. Its damage is similar to that of the unique spears, so that shouldn't be a consideration when using this weapon. Fire and Lightning and Sacred and Flame Art are essentially tied for first place when it comes to damage, with Magic coming in a close second and Heavy a distant third. Heavy outperforms Keen by about 12 attack rating at this point in the game, which is not much, and Cold is not far behind Keen. Because you have many different infusions available to you, you can either go dual wield with any other Great Spear, or you can use a Great Shield and block counter with Heavy, Cold, or Fire very easily. This makes the Lance a bit more flexible than some other Great Spears, and is a good pairing with other Great Spears, as you can set the infusion to match the spear you're pairing it with. So that wraps up our video on Great Spears. I hope you found it informational. One thing I forgot to mention earlier that I do want to mention is that Great Spears do not fluctuate much between weight and damage. There's only about a 4 or 3 weight fluctuation across the entire group, and the damage is only about 20 to 25 damage and attack rating from the lowest to highest in this group. So I did not mention, which ones deal the most damage or least damage in this group because there's such little variance, it doesn't matter that much. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring content on this channel. We still have more weapons to do. I plan to get around to shields and armor, as well as some talismans and Ashes of War as well. I might start mixing those in the coming weeks, just to mix it up a little bit, do something a little bit fresh, keep weapons and other things for a little bit later. We'll see how that goes. Let me know what you guys want to see in the comments. If there's certain Ashes of War you want to see, or weapons or armor, let me know in the comments below.